Joe was from Epsom. She knew that because that was where she had found him. Nadine was from South Barnstead, a town 15 miles northeast of Epsom. She had been searching methodically for other healthy people, reluctant to leave her own house in her own hometown. She worked in concentric circles which grew larger and larger. She had found only Joe, delirious and fevered from some sort of animal bite, rat or squirrel from the size of it. He had been sitting on the lawn of a house in Epsom, naked except for his underpants, butcher knife clutched in his hands like an old Stone Age savage or a dying but still vicious pygmy. Welcome everyone to another installment of my Stephen King analysis series, and to be precise, to the second part of my King's Algorithm series. Yes, I haven't forgotten this one, it's just that we were having such a good time with the normal videos that this one fell to the side for a bit. But, as I am a little bit slow reading Needful Things, because boy, that doorstopper is 700 pages, not as many as the stand, but still a good number, well, this is a good time as any to continue with our dissection, right? As I said last time, in case you haven't watched that video, we're going through the real Stephen King character tropes, the ones he repeats over and over and over again, and why he does so, as well as how by combining them we can get to the bigger message that his book keeps harping on, in the eternal fight between good and evil. I'm AdalisaZ, and today we are continuing our hike through Stephen King's longest book, as we meet the second archetype, the child. That, in the stand, is Little Joe, real name Leo Rockwell. He may have a bit smaller role than other children in other books, but that doesn't change his importance, especially in relationship to the artist, or good friend Larry Underwood. In our last video about my theory, I told you guys about who the artist was and why they are so important in King's books. And well, if the artist is the only one who can actually face the evil in the King's universe, he can only do so because the child inspires them to fight. Yes, artists in King's world have a lot of romantic interests, and they may be inspired to save them from time to time. But the real person who makes them get off their chair and start proactively fighting whatever evil has come to their lives is usually a child that is not related to them in blood. There are some exceptions to that, but it's always a child. In Salem's Lot, where we first see this dynamic, King writes that the difference between adults and children is that an adult has lost his ability to dream. At the same time, an artist is an adult who has managed to keep this ability, but also creates dreams of their own, making their livelihood with imagination. This is why the artist is the only one who can communicate with the child on the same level and understand when evil is something beyond what we consider normal. And, well, there are novels where it's very easy to pinpoint who the child is. I mean, in The Shining we have exactly one child in the whole novel, so no need for Sherlock Holmes there, right? There are others in which there are so many children around, named children too, that we need to specify a bit more which one is the important one. It, by the way, is a bit of a special case given that the losers are children for half of the novel, and then most of them, the survivors to be precise, become artists in the adulthood. And of course, they are inspired by their own childhood selves to fight it. Very special case. Anyway, the first characteristic every child has is that they are smart. Smarter than their peers of the same age, and sometimes smarter than the adults around them. They know more of what is going on in the town than the adults. Some of them understand things about their age, even when people don't tell them exactly what is going on and without needing any psychic power. Although Danny Torrance had some extra help there, other children in King's novels don't need that extra bit. They also tend to be somewhat distant from their parents, who usually don't understand or aren't equipped to understand their special child. This is not to say that the parents are neglectful or hate the child. It's just that they can't understand them. They, the parents, are also more often than not blind to the evil that their child is facing. That is, when they are not killed by said evil. To an absurd point, and if they realize that their child is running around with an older person, even if said person is younger than themselves, they will try to put a stop to it as soon as possible. By the way, yes, most of King's artists and children are male, but I am using the neutral words to include a few women he has also written about. In any case, between their smart and their distance from their parents, the child is usually seen as a rebel, and without a real authority figure in their life. Other people might even badmouth their parents for being unable to keep the kid under control. They are also almost never related by blood to the artist, Danny Torrance being one of the very few exceptions, and thus there may be a lot of obstacles from them to meet up. Some may look as a coincidence, but others are very clear attempts by the antagonist to keep them apart, like in Bag of Bones that we will talk about in the future. Finally, the child is usually a survivor. They will suffer loss, yes, and sometimes the loss will be their whole family or their innocence. But unlike the artist, the child tends to survive at the end, because if they didn't survive, then the artist's fight would be for nothing. But now that we have that clear, let's go to the specifics with Leo Rockwell, the feral child Larry met in his way to Boulder in the stand. Joe, as he's introduced to us at first, is one of the most tragic kind of survivors of the Captain Trips pandemic. He lost both his parents to the illness, probably all of the town where he lived in, because by the time Larry gets to meet him and his new caretaker Nadine Cross, and boy, we will have a lot to talk about Nadine later on, Joe is completely non-verbal and in fact tries to kill Larry in order to keep Nadine safe. Thankfully, Nadine stops him, and so they join Larry in their long walk to Boulder. We have absolutely no idea how long Joe was completely alone, nor if his mutism is due to his time alone and the trauma he experienced by seeing his parents and neighbor die one by one with no help coming and the whole civilization collapsing a little after, or because of the fever that he had when Nadine found him. We don't know if it was due to him trusting someone else, since all we get to know about him is what Nadine guesses, including his name, that was chosen because, in her life as a teacher, any little girl whose name she hadn't known had always been a Jane, any little boy a Joe. We also know that Joe only trusts her and had tried to kill others before they meet Larry. In fact, as I mentioned before, in a big change from other children meeting their artist, Joe was quite ready to kill Larry too, not once but thrice, only to be stopped constantly by Nadine. However, when Nadine convinces Larry to play a beat for them on their first night together as a group, Joe falls in love with the music and the guitar. And just like that, Nadine loses her place as the only person Joe trusts, especially when Larry discovers that, while Joe had obviously never played the guitar before, he was an incredibly fast student and could replicate a song perfectly after seeing Larry play it once. More importantly, even when Larry had thrown away his butcher knife, because, come on, that was a little bit of a threat, and that knife had served as his safety net even before he met Nadine, Larry gifted Joe with the guitar. And that is the biggest treasure the artist can give a child, the gift of art. A bit after that particular discovery, Joe talks to them for the first time when he sees another human, Lucy Swam, whom we will also talk about more later, and she helps to get Joe out of his shell more and more. They talk about their nightmares about the dark man who chases him and the black woman who becomes them to join her in Nebraska. And it's there in Nebraska with Mother Abigail, who of course will be the subject of a lot of discussion later, when we finally learn his real name and identity. He's not Joe, but Leo Rockwell. And when he declares that, he finally cuts his ties with Nadine completely. After that, Leo disappears a bit from the main narrative. But when the group is starting to be created to fight Flag directly, he's one of the reasons why Larry decides to go. Because for Larry, Leo represents the future, the one that Flags wants to destroy. And so, Larry leaves, asking Leo to take care of Lucy until he comes back, even when both Larry and Leo, who is also implied to have mild telepathy, although that doesn't play much into the plot, know that Larry won't come back. As I said, the child is a bit harder to identify than the artist, especially when you have a lot of children around. But once you put together the kid that is smarter than their peers and it's a bit neglected by their parents' part, they are a lot easier to get. They rarely mix with other archetypes in the same character, with very few exceptions on novels I haven't reviewed yet, so I don't want to spoil you on those. And just like the artist, it's very rare when a novel doesn't include them. We have a couple of novels where we have an artist without an actual child in the mix, Misery for example, although one could argue that the novel is Paul's child, but that doesn't count. But in the rare occasion when we don't have an artist and there is a child, things never end well for the child. Carrie, by the way, is one of those few. While yes, Carrie and Tommy wrote poetry, and not that bad poetry from what we are told, neither can be called the artist, and the one who survives to adulthood to actually write a book after high school, Sue, it's not especially artistic at first. It's of course also that Carrie was the first novel King published, and so the algorithm is not in place quite yet. We have a lot of the other archetypes there, ready to roar, but not all of them. On the side of the artist without a child, we could mention Dennis from Christine, but he's a teenager, and so is Arnie, his best friend, and the real reason he goes off against Christine. Sure, he also wanted to save Blake, but his real motive, his real drive, so to speak, was to save Arnie, or at least Arnie's soul. But if I go through a list of every child in King's novels, hell, even only on the ones I have already covered, we are never going to end. So let's continue the trend I set into the artist and pick 4 specific examples of these early novels to round more who the child is in this King Tarot. And for this case, we will go with Mark Petrie in Salem's Lot, who also happens to be the first proper child in King's work, Danny Torrance from The Shining, Bobby McGee from Prime Starter, and finally, Healy Brown from the Tommyknockers, as he's a very special case. Mark is our prototype child. It is in his description where King first posits that children are people who haven't lost their ability to dream, and that is why they can, on one side, be terrified at 1 minute and perfectly okay the next, and on the other, can understand the supernatural evil that comes to town a lot easier than anyone else. He also tries hard to fight said evil before any adult there had even realized that there was evil to be fought. But at the end, it's just thanks to Ben Mears, or artist of the book, that he survives, and they end up as father and son due to Mike's parents' death. But one very, very important thing here is that where Ben bumbles a lot into finding how to fight Barlow the vampire, Mike knows how to do it from the very beginning, due to his special interests, horror movies, and he also is the first human who deals a real hard blow to Barlow's plan by killing their Renfield. Then we have Danny, who is our first child who actually has powers that make him strange to his parents, even if both Jack and Wendy love him dearly and try hard to accommodate him. In fact, Wendy never questions Danny's intuition, even as the novel advances and Danny's intuition is proved to be actual telepathy. And although I have said this in 2 videos now, it bears repeating. The only reason why Jack managed to fight the Overlook long enough that the hotel explodes is his love for his son. So once again, the child survives thanks to the artist, even if the artist himself dies because of the addiction, and we are not going to repeat that. Next, we have one of the very, very rare female children in King's novels, Bobby McGee. Just like Danny, she has powers, but unlike Danny, so do her parents, who also dote on her. However, her alienation from them is more physical than mental. Because of the shop, her mother is dead, and by the end of the book, she's also separated from her father, who happens to be her artist too. She is his inspiration to overcome his addiction, far more successfully than Danny with Jack, and in a very special case, he is her inspiration to escape. The man who tries to take her father's place, by the way, is not an artist at all, and is a completely different archetype, the Dark Man, and because of that, he doesn't succeed. And yes, the child survives thanks to the artist who dies in the process of giving her the strength to save herself. Again. Because, again, the artist was an addict in that book. Finally, we have Healy Brown, a child who is exactly said not to have any artistic talent at all, even if he wishes very hard to be a magician, and who is special because he is the only child who never has any direct contact with the artist in the whole novel. Healy and Garth never meet, and yet it is Healy's survival what makes Garth fight against his long-life friend and the whole town of Tommyknockers instead of just letting himself die. And Healy and his brother, also smart child but not the child, survive, thanks to Garth's final sacrifice. In all these examples except the first, the artist dies to save the child. This also happens in The Stand, of course, but as I said in my last video about The Stand, it is also the one where the artist is not also an addict, and in every example here, with the exception of Salem's Lot, the survivor, our artists are also addicts one way or another. Same as when the artist always survives, if he's not also sharing their place with a different archetype, in a specific the addict, the child will always survive if there is an artist there to save them. If there is no artist or the artist is too far away, the child will die or worse, as we saw in Cuyo and we will see in another couple of novels where there is no artist. Because, once again, without the ability to dream, there is no actual life to be had. The child is probably one of the foremost recognizable king archetypes next to the artist. You know, king written only about writers. The addict and the violent man, aka the bully. Their role also extends to pretty much every short novella too, with the very specific exception of the horrible ending of the Mist movie. You guys know I hate that ending. By the time we're done with the algorithm theory, you will understand completely why, but here we have another example. The artist, as I said in the last algorithm video, is forbidden to kill himself, but is also forced to kill the child. This doesn't happen in any other king-related story. If the artist is next to the child will survive. The children that die, or in the case of one particular story we'll see later on, have a fate worse than death, are the ones who are not reached in time by the artist or never got an artist to help them. Think about poor Kate Creed or Tad Trenton, whom despite being the artist's son, wasn't saved because at the time the evil came from him, his father was out of state. I want to thank my dear patrons, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica and Ali Riley, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Song, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos will not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/AdalisaZ, with a link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or if you prefer a one-off offer, at Coffee, with just one donation of $3, you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions for future videos in the comment box below. As before, I am not sure if the next video will be Needful Things. It is a long book, even if it's just half the length of the stand, or another one of these. But when we return to the stand, we will talk about the role of the sacrifice in Stephen King's novels as we have a nice cup of coffee while we talk.